On the Mississippi plantation, fear was not whispered, it was performed. Everyone knew the ritual. When the master decided it was time to remind people who ruled, he didn't shout or threaten, he chose. Always the weakest, always in public, and always with the same outcome, humiliation that echoed long after the moment ended. Strength, he believed, was visible. Power, he believed, was absolute. And fear, he believed, would last forever. That belief had never failed him until one day it did. On that morning nothing seemed different. The air was thick, the work relentless, the silence heavy with obedience. Then the master's eyes settled on someone no one expected. Thin, quiet, easily overlooked, a man who had survived by staying unnoticed, who carried himself as though he had already been erased. This one. The word landed like a sentence. Those who heard it felt the familiar tightening in their chests, the helplessness of knowing what came next and the guilt of surviving it. The chosen man stepped forward without protest, without drama. To the master, this confirmed everything he thought he knew. Fragile people break quickly. Weakness reveals itself under pressure. What he did not see was what years of suffering had built in silence. He did not see the discipline shaped by endurance, the intelligence sharpened by observation, or the inner fire kept carefully hidden because showing it too soon meant destruction. He did not understand that the quiet ones often carry the most weight. What was meant to be another display of control became something else entirely. As the moment unfolded, fear began to change direction. Certainty cracked, and the crowd, trained never to hope, felt something stir that had long been buried. Not freedom, not victory, but doubt in the power that ruled them. This is a story about cruelty and arrogance, and the blindness they create. It is about the danger of underestimating others, and how the strongest forces are often the ones no one sees coming. It is about a man who believed he understood weakness, and the moment he chose wrong, because sometimes the greatest mistake of those in power is believing they are incapable of making one. In the deep Mississippi countryside, the plantation stood like a kingdom built on fear. Power there was not maintained through respect or justice, but through spectacle. Carefully designed cruelty meant to remind every enslaved person of their place. At the center of this system was the master, a man who believed dominance had to be seen to be believed. Words were not enough for him. Punishment had to be public, humiliating, and unforgettable. Among his many methods, none was more feared than the forced fights. At irregular intervals, the master would order 2 enslaved people to be brought into the open yard. There was no reward for winning, no mercy for losing. The purpose was never sport, it was control. The master almost always chose the weakest individuals, those who were malnourished, injured, young, or emotionally broken. He believed that forcing the vulnerable to fight achieved 2 things. It crushed any remaining hope in the victims, and it sent a clear message to everyone watching. If the weakest could be humiliated so easily, what chance did anyone else have? The events followed a cruel pattern, a sudden command, whispers spreading through the quarters, fear tightening chests as people gathered, knowing they had no choice but to watch. The chosen individuals were dragged forward, often trembling, not just from fear of pain, but from the shame of being exposed, measured, and deemed expendable. The master would stand elevated, arms folded, eyes cold, as if observing livestock rather than human beings. The emotions in those moments were heavy and layered. Terror was the most obvious, terror of injury, of punishment, of death. But beneath that lived deeper feelings, helplessness, anger with nowhere to go, and a silent grief that came from being stripped of dignity again and again. For the onlookers, there was guilt added to the fear. They survived another day, but survival came at the cost of witnessing someone else's suffering. The master mistook silence for acceptance. What he failed to understand was that weakness, as he defined it, was only surface level. He saw thin bodies, slow movements, bowed heads. He did not see endurance shaped by years of hardship. He did not see intelligence sharpened by constant observation. He did not see emotional strength built from surviving loss after loss. His system relied on the belief that power always flows from the top down and that fear erases resistance. Yet fear does not erase humanity, it compresses it. Over time, these forced fights created something the master never intended. While he believed he was isolating people through terror, he was unknowingly binding them together through shared suffering. Each public act of cruelty became a memory held by many, a silent record of injustice. The enslaved learned who was targeted, how decisions were made, and how arrogance guided the master's choices. They learned his habits, his blind spots. The emotional toll was immense. Those labeled weak carried a double burden, the physical exhaustion of labor and the psychological weight of knowing they were seen as disposable. Many internalized this label, believing it themselves. Others, however, learned to hide what little strength they had. They moved carefully, spoke softly, and kept their resilience invisible. In a world where strength attracted punishment, invisibility became survival. This is where the master's cruelty turned into his greatest flaw. By repeatedly choosing those he believed incapable of resistance, he trained himself to underestimate them completely. His confidence grew unchecked. Each successful display of dominance convinced him he understood human nature, that fear had made him untouchable. He did not question his choices because nothing had challenged them. Yet, the lesson of this keynote lies not only in the brutality itself, but in the psychology behind it. The master believed that breaking the weakest would break everyone. In reality, it revealed his dependence on appearances. He ruled through assumption, not understanding. He confused silence with submission and frailty with failure. For the enslaved people, these events taught a different lesson. They learned that survival was not always about visible strength. Sometimes it was about patience. Sometimes it was about endurance. And sometimes it was about waiting for the moment when cruelty overreached itself. This keynote sets the emotional and moral foundation of the story. It explains why fear ruled the plantation, why the master felt invincible, and why the eventual turning point, when he chose wrong, was inevitable. A system built on cruelty always creates its own undoing because it teaches the oppressed far more about the oppressor than the oppressor ever learns about them. In the end, the forced fights were meant to erase hope. Instead, they preserved it, quietly, invisibly, and growing stronger with every act of injustice. The day began like many others on the Mississippi plantation. Heavy air, slow footsteps, and a silence shaped by fear. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be remembered, and that was precisely why it became unforgettable. The master had already decided there would be another fight. He did not announce it loudly. He never needed to. A short command to the overseer was enough. Word traveled quickly through glances and broken whispers, settling in the stomachs of the enslaved like a stone. Everyone knew what it meant. Someone would be chosen, someone would be broken in front of the rest. The master walked among the workers with the confidence of a man who believed he understood people completely. His eyes did not search for the strong. They searched for what he believed was weakness: slumped shoulders, slow hands, quiet voices, bodies that seemed worn down by labor and time. To him, fragility was something you could see. That was his greatest mistake. He stopped in front of a man who barely looked up, thin, reserved, unremarkable, someone who never spoke unless spoken to, who never argued, who never drew attention. To the master, this person represented exactly what he wanted the others to see: someone small in presence, someone who appeared defeated by life itself. This one, the master said. A ripple of emotion moved through the group. Shock, confusion, fear, but also something else, quieter and harder to name. Those who had worked beside the chosen man knew things the master did not. They had seen him endure injuries without complaint. They had noticed how he watched everything carefully, how he remembered details, how he conserved his strength. But no one spoke. Speaking never helped. The chosen man stepped forward slowly. Inside him, emotions collided. Fear was there, of course. He was human, but fear was not alone. There was also a deep, steady calm, something shaped over years of surviving loss, hunger, humiliation, and pain. He had learned long ago that reacting openly only invited more cruelty. What he carried inside had been hidden on purpose. The master mistook this calm for emptiness. As preparations were made, the master felt a familiar satisfaction. This was another lesson, another reminder of who held power. He believed strength was loud, physical, obvious. He believed that those who did not display it did not possess it. His world, you left no room for unseen endurance or quiet resolve. The moment before the confrontation was heavy with emotion. The crowd stood still, torn between dread and hope they barely allowed themselves to feel. For the chosen man, time seemed to stretch. Memories surfaced, faces lost, promises broken, moments of kindness that had kept him alive. He did not see himself as strong. He saw himself as someone who had survived when survival was the only option. And survival teaches lessons no master can understand. What followed was not an explosion of sudden heroism. It was something more unsettling. The man did not panic. He did not rush. He did not crumble as expected. His movements were controlled, his focus sharp. Each choice he made revealed a depth the master had never considered. The master's confidence began to shift, not into fear yet, but into confusion. This was not how the story was supposed to go. The fragile were meant to break quickly. That was the rule. That was the comfort of his cruelty. But strength, when it has been forced into hiding for too long, does not disappear. It waits. The emotional core of this moment lies in contrast. On one side stood Aragon, sloughed, unquestioned, and blind. On the other stood resilience, quiet, shaped by suffering and underestimated. The master believed power came from choosing who was weak. He never considered that weakness might be a mask, or that strength might grow best in silence. For the onlookers, something shifted inside as well. Hope stirred cautiously, not the kind that makes promises, but the kind that whispers maybe he was wrong. Maybe we are more than what he sees. Even if the moment ended badly, the idea itself could not be taken back. The lesson of this keynote is clear and timeless. Judging others by appearance is not just unfair. It is dangerous. The master's world. You reduced people to surfaces and missed everything that lay beneath. He believed control came from certainty, but certainty made him careless. This moment marks the beginning of his downfall, not because he immediately lost power, but because he revealed how shallow his understanding truly was. He chose wrong not by accident, but by habit. His cruelty trained him to overlook depth, patience, and hidden strength. For the chosen man, the moment was not about victory. It was about being seen, if only briefly, not as fragile, but as human. And once that truth entered the open air, it could never be fully buried again. This keynote reminds us that the most dangerous strength is often the kind no one notices until it is too late, and that those who rely on fear to rule will eventually be undone by what they fail to see. What the Master never understood, what men like him rarely understand, was that true strength does not announce itself. It does not shout, threaten, or demand attention. On that Mississippi plantation, the chosen slave had learned this truth early. Survival had taught him that the loud were punished first, and the visible were broken quickest. So he made himself small, not because he was weak, but because he was wise. Inside him lived a quiet resilience, built layer by layer over years of hardship. He had learned endurance long before that day. Each sunrise brought labor that bent the body, and each night brought exhaustion that settled into the bones. Yet he rose again, not with hope of reward, but with discipline. Pain did not surprise him any more. Hunger did not shock him. What remained was a steady inner rhythm that refused to stop. That rhythm, slow, patient, controlled, was his first strength. The Master never saw it. What he did see was a man who avoided attention, who spoke little, who obeyed without argument. To the Master, this meant emptiness. To those who truly watched, it meant calculation. The chosen man listened more than he spoke. He noticed patterns, who lost their temper quickly, who underestimated others, who acted without thinking. He understood that knowledge, in a place ruled by cruelty, was a form of protection. His intelligence was not academic, but practical and sharp. He knew when to conserve energy and when to use it. He knew how to read moods, how to sense danger before it arrived. He had learned to adapt, not just physically, but mentally. Every injustice became a lesson. Every humiliation became information. While others burned with visible anger, he stored his quietly, refining it into focus rather than rage. And then there was the inner fire. It was not the fire of revenge or hatred. It was something steadier and more dangerous. It was the belief, kept secret even from himself at times, that he was more than what had been decided for him, that his life, however constrained, still held meaning, that his spirit had not been claimed, no matter how tightly his body was controlled. This fire did not push him to act recklessly. It taught him patience. On the day he was chosen, this hidden strength came into sharp focus. Fear was present, yes, but it did not overwhelm him. His breathing slowed instead of quickening. His mind cleared instead of panicking. While others expected collapse, he centered himself, drawing on years of quiet preparation he never knew he was making. The Master saw stillness and assumed surrender. In reality, that stillness was discipline. The man assessed his surroundings, measured distances, weighed possibilities. His movements were not driven by desperation, but by control. Every step was intentional, every reaction restrained. This was not instinct. It was earned composure. Emotionally, this moment was complex. There was grief for all the times he had been overlooked and dismissed. There was anger at the system that forced him into this position. But beneath both was resolve. If he had been unseen for so long, then being underestimated was no longer a curse. It was an advantage. For those watching, the shift was subtle but powerful. They saw something familiar yet rarely acknowledged. Someone like them, long ignored, standing firm, not shouting, not pleading, just present. It awakened something deeply human in the crowd, a recognition that strength did not always look the way power said it did. The master, however, remained blind. His arrogance had trained him to overlook depth. He believed intelligence belonged to those who commanded, not those who endured. He believed resilience came from authority, not survival. And because of this belief, he never questioned his own assumptions. He had reduced human beings to roles, weak, strong, useful, disposable. Once assigned, these labels were never reconsidered. That failure to see was the master's greatest weakness. The lesson of this keynote reaches beyond the story itself. It reminds us that systems built on domination reward surface judgments and punish complexity. They train people in power to stop looking closely, to rely on stereotypes instead of understanding. And in doing so, they create the conditions for their own collapse. Quiet resilience is dangerous to oppressive power because it cannot be easily predicted or controlled. Intelligence that observes instead of confronts survives longer. Inner fire that burns without spectacle cannot be extinguished through fear alone. For the chosen man, this moment was not about proving anything to the master. It was about honoring everything he had carried silently for so long, every ignored pain, every swallowed word. Every night he chose endurance over despair. His strength had been underestimated not because it was small, but because it did not perform. And when such strength finally steps into the open, it does not need to announce itself. Its presence alone is enough to change the direction of a story. This keynote teaches a powerful truth. Never confuse quiet with weakness or silence with emptiness. The most resilient people are often those who have learned to survive without recognition. And when the moment comes, it is not loud power that reshapes fate, but the steady force of a spirit that refused to be broken. What was meant to be humiliation had always followed the same script. The master chose. The crowd watched. Fear did the rest. Every forced confrontation ended the same way, with dignity stripped away and control reinforced. That predictability was the foundation of his power, but on this day the script failed. The moment was designed to crush, not to challenge. The master expected quick submission, confusion, and shame. He expected the chosen man to falter, to make mistakes driven by panic. He expected the watching crowd to look away, relieved it was not them. Everything about the scene was meant to reaffirm one truth: resistance was useless. Instead, something unfamiliar unfolded. From the very beginning, the chosen man did not perform weakness the way the master anticipated. There was no frantic movement, no collapse under pressure. His posture was steady. His eyes were focused. The stillness unsettled the space, though no one could yet name why. Silence stretched longer than usual, thick with uncertainty. The master mistook this calm for delay, for hesitation that would soon turn into failure. But the delay was intention. As the confrontation progressed, the difference became undeniable. The chosen man reacted with control rather than desperation. He anticipated instead of flinching. Each small decision disrupted the master's expectations. It wasn't just the physical balance of the situation shifting. It was the emotional balance. Confusion crept into the master's expression. He leaned forward. His confidence wavered just slightly. This was not part of the performance he had staged. Humiliation was supposed to flow one way. Yet here was a moment where authority did not translate into dominance, where fear did not erase clarity. For the first time, the master was not being watched with certainty, but with doubt. The crowd felt it too. A ripple passed through those standing at the edges. People who had trained themselves not to feel suddenly felt everything at once: shock, disbelief, and a cautious spark of hope they had long buried. No one spoke, no one dared move, but something had shifted inside them. The humiliation meant for one man began to turn outward. Every second the chosen man remained composed, stripped a layer from the master's authority. Power, after all, depends on belief. The master had taught everyone that he controlled outcomes, that he knew who would fall and who would stand. Now that belief was cracking in real time, the master responded the only way he knew how, with anger. His voice rose, his commands sharpened. He tried to force the moment back into place, to reassert control through volume and threat. But anger revealed weakness. The more he reacted, the clearer it became that control was slipping from his grasp. The chosen man did not mirror that anger. He remained grounded. This contrast was devastating. What made the reversal truly shocking was not a single dramatic act. It was the accumulation of restraint. The man's quiet confidence dismantled the master's cruelty more effectively than defiance ever could. He did not need to win a spectacle. He only needed to refuse to be broken by it. That refusal echoed loudly. For the master, this was more than embarrassment. It was exposure. His power had always depended on the idea that he understood human limits, that he could identify weakness on sight, that his judgment was final. Now, standing before someone he had misread so completely, he was confronted with his own blindness. Fear touched him, not fear of harm, but fear of losing the story he told himself. The crowd saw that fear, and once fear is seen in someone who rules by terror, it cannot be unseen. The master's authority had not vanished, but it had fractured. Cracks had formed where certainty once lived. The emotional impact of this reversal was profound. For the chosen man, it was not triumph, it was validation. Years of silence, endurance, and restraint suddenly made sense. He had not been surviving in vain. His patience had protected something essential inside him, and now that inner strength had altered the balance of power, even if only briefly. For the onlookers, the moment became a memory they would carry forever. Proof that the master was not infallible. Proof that weakness was not what they had been taught to believe. Even if the system remained, the illusion had been damaged, and illusions are fragile once exposed. The lesson of this keynote is deeply human and universally relevant. Power that relies on humiliation is unstable because it demands constant performance. It must always be proven, always displayed, always enforced. The moment it fails to produce the expected outcome, it begins to unravel. The master believed control came from forcing others into submission. In reality, control depends on shared belief. When that belief breaks, even slightly, authority loses its grip. This reversal teaches us that resistance does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like composure. Sometimes it looks like refusing to internalize the role assigned to you. And sometimes the most disruptive act is simply not breaking when you are expected to. What was meant to erase one man instead revealed the limits of cruelty itself. From that day forward, the master's power would never feel as solid as it once had. And for those who witnessed the moment, something irreversible had occurred. They had seen fear change sides. That is the true shock of the reversal, not the action itself, but the realization that control based on humiliation can fail, and when it does, it exposes how fragile domination has always been. Cruelty has a way of distorting vision. It convinces those who wield it that they are sharper, smarter, and more powerful than everyone around them. On the Mississippi plantation, the master lived inside this distortion for years. Each act of dominance reinforced his belief that he understood people completely, that he could measure a person's worth at a glance and predict their limits with certainty. Arrogance became his armor. He believed fear made him untouchable. He believed repetition made his methods foolproof. Every time he humiliated someone without consequence, his confidence grew heavier and more rigid. He stopped questioning himself. He stopped observing closely. Cruelty had simplified the world for him into categories that felt permanent: strong and weak, ruler and ruled, chooser and chosen. This false clarity blinded him. The events that led to his downfall did not begin with rebellion or open defiance. They began with a mistake born of arrogance, choosing someone he assumed was fragile, someone he believed incapable of disrupting the order he had created. To the master, this choice felt routine. He did not sense danger because cruelty had trained him to underestimate depth. That underestimation was fatal to his authority. What the master failed to understand was that systems built on oppression educate the oppressed far more than they educate the oppressor. While he relied on fear to maintain control, those beneath him learned patience, observation, and restraint. They learned how arrogance moved, how it spoke, how it made decisions. They learned that cruelty follows patterns, and patterns can be broken. The chosen man was not exceptional because he fought back. He was exceptional because he refused to accept the story written for him. His composure, resilience, and clarity did more than disrupt a single moment. They exposed a larger truth. The master's power was not rooted in strength or wisdom. It was rooted in unchecked assumptions. Emotionally, this exposure was devastating for the master. For the first time, he faced something he could not dominate with volume or threat: his own misjudgment. Confusion unsettled him before fear ever did. His certainty cracked, and with it, the image he had built of himself. Cruelty had made him dependent on being right, and arrogance had convinced him he always was. Watching that certainty unravel forced him into a space he had long denied: vulnerability. For the onlookers, the emotional shift was just as powerful, though different in nature. They did not suddenly feel free. They did not believe the system had ended, but they felt something equally important: clarity. They saw that the master's authority was not natural or inevitable. It was maintained by belief, and belief could change. That realization lingered. The true downfall of an oppressor rarely comes in a single dramatic collapse. More often it arrives quietly in the erosion of confidence and control. After that day, the master still held power, but it no longer felt absolute. Doubt followed him, seen in his hesitation, in his harsher tone, in the way he watched more closely than before. Arrogance had once allowed him to move without fear. Now fear moved with him. The lesson of this keynote reaches far beyond one plantation or one moment in history. It speaks to a universal truth about power and human nature. Cruelty narrows perspective. It convinces people in authority that others are simpler than they are, weaker than they are, less capable than they are. This belief is comforting, but it is false. Underestimation is not a minor error. It is a dangerous one. When people in power stop seeing others as complex human beings, they lose the ability to predict outcomes accurately. They stop listening, they stop adapting, and eventually they are surprised, not because the unexpected occurs, but because they refuse to imagine it could. This story shows that downfall begins the moment arrogance replaces awareness. The master did not fall because the chosen man was stronger than him. He fell because he was blind, blind to quiet resilience, blind to intelligence shaped by survival, blind to the way cruelty teaches its victims patience rather than obedience. He mistook silence for emptiness and restraint for weakness. That mistake exposed the limits of his rule. For the chosen man and those who witnessed the moment, the lesson was equally profound. Strength does not need permission to exist. Dignity does not depend on recognition. Even in the most controlled environments, inner clarity and self-respect remain powerful forces. The story does not suggest that endurance alone ends injustice, but it shows how arrogance accelerates its own destruction. Cruelty demands constant reinforcement. It must always prove itself, and in doing so, it creates opportunities for exposure. Every public act of humiliation carries risk because it assumes the oppressor understands the human spirit better than the oppressed. History and this story prove otherwise. In the end, the master's downfall was not loud or immediate. It was internal and irreversible. He could never again fully trust his judgment, never again believe completely in the labels he assigned, never again stand without the shadow of doubt cast by his own mistake. And that is the most enduring lesson of this keynote. Those who rule through cruelty are not undone by rebellion alone, but by their refusal to truly see others. Arrogance narrows vision, cruelty hardens assumptions, and together they create blindness. And blindness, more than any external threat, leads to downfall. The master chose wrong because he believed he could never be wrong. That belief was the beginning of the end. In the end, nothing on the plantation looked different. Yet everything had changed. The master still stood where he always had. The fences still enclosed the land. The system that fed on cruelty did not collapse in a single day, but the illusion that had sustained it for so long was broken, and once broken, it could never be restored. The man the master had chosen, dismissed as fragile, overlooked as insignificant, did not become a hero in the way stories often demand. He did not shout, he did not celebrate, he did not claim victory. What he did was far more powerful. He endured without breaking, stood without surrendering his dignity, and revealed the limits of a power built on arrogance. That single moment exposed a truth the master could not escape. His control had never come from strength or wisdom. It came from fear and assumption, and fear, once questioned, loses its grip. The master had believed he could identify weakness at a glance. He had believed silence meant emptiness. He had believed cruelty made him untouchable. He was wrong. For those who witnessed the moment, something lasting took root. Not rebellion, not reckless hope, but awareness. They had seen that resilience could be quiet, that intelligence could hide behind obedience, and that inner fire could survive even the harshest conditions. They had learned that power depends on belief, and belief can change. The chosen man returned to his place among them, outwardly unchanged, yet carrying something new confirmation that his endurance had meaning, that surviving with dignity was not failure, that being underestimated was not a curse, but sometimes a shield. As for the master, doubt followed him like a shadow. His certainty was gone. His judgments no longer felt absolute. Every choice he made afterward carried the memory of the day he chose wrong. Cruelty had blinded him, and arrogance had sealed his fate, not in a dramatic fall, but in a slow, irreversible unraveling of authority. This story leaves us with a lesson that echoes far beyond its setting. Never mistake quiet for weakness. Never confuse power with wisdom, and never underestimate those who have learned to survive without being seen. because history does not always change through loud victories. Sometimes it changes in a single moment of clarity, when cruelty is exposed, arrogance is humbled, and a silent strength reminds the world that dignity cannot be owned, erased, or controlled. And once that truth is revealed, no amount of fear can put it back in chains.